Welcome to our podcast. I'm Andy Murray, the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association, and today I'm joined by Huda Assad, the Capital Projects Lead of UK, Ireland and Africa, and Dale Foong, the COO of Movar. So welcome, Huda, welcome, Dale.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
So today's podcast is on the topic of AI, in particular AI in major projects. And it's the second of three podcasts we've got on this topic, which is sort of sandwiched between a seminar that we had back in June on the pace of change of AI, which Huda and Dale participated in as our speakers and panelists, and our annual conference in October, which is going to be on the topic of AI. And it's the title of our conference is AI is the answer. Now, what's the question? And I think Dale in particular will come on in a moment to the contribution you made to the June seminar, but that does feel like everything. Well, we can get AI to do that, but actually we need to really focus on those things that will make the biggest impact, particularly with the lag, if you like, of major projects compared to other domains. So what we're going to do today is just follow up on a couple of themes that came from the seminar back in June, and then we'll do a bit of a trailer for some of the topics we're going to cover at our annual conference. So I'm going to start with Dale, if I may. So Dale, I sort of regard you as a bit of the Ross Atkins, the BBC chap of the projects world, in that you're just a fantastic sort of explainer of things, and you sort of cover the whole spectrum of project management. And when I sort of listen to some of the talks that you give, I just think, yeah, you've nailed it in terms of how you've explained perhaps sometimes a complex topic. So at the seminar back in June, you gave us a bit of an overview what we really mean by AI and how that relates to major projects. And I really liked how you explained it as well. You broke it down into two parts, really, the artificial part and the intelligence part. And you used a phrase which was I forgot it, but the unnatural ability to reason and make judgments. And I think you even said it's a bit magical when we think of it in that way. So if you could, perhaps for the benefit of those who are listening today, first of all, just introduce yourself and say who you are, and then, if we can, just give sort of a bit of a repeat of the explainer that you provided us on our seminar back in June.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andy. And yeah, it was good fun. And I mean, partly I sort of dumb these things down for myself so I can understand them in the first instance, because I'm just a mere mortal. But I think the important thing is that because we have so many acronyms ordinarily when we're delivering projects, when you're bringing AI into the equation and you're thinking about what does machine learning mean, what does large language models mean, then you get into neural networks and NLP, and all of a sudden a whole new scope of acronyms to learn. People get lost in it. So for me, if you just dumb it down, you just think, okay, what is, as you're saying, what is artificial? Artificial, the definition is just, it's not made by humans. So the clothes we wear, the buildings we're in, the cars we drive, that's all artificial, right? That's all artificial. That's all it is. It's nothing scary. And intelligence, as you're saying, is just the ability to reason and make judgments, and pulling those together, the unnatural ability to reason and make judgments, which is pretty cool if you think about it, because all of a sudden we're having this artificial, this man-made way of going, okay, or human-made way of having a consultant almost, or someone to reflect off of and go, are there things that I'm not considering and seeing? And then you apply that to projects as well. One of the things I said, and my job in that conference was to sort of just lay a foundation. And one of the things I said was that in its current state, it is not a replacement for human jobs right now. It might be in the future, and things will evolve. We spoke about, the lift operator. We spoke about, before washing clothes was a job, right? Now we have the washing machine. And so we evolve. Before we had mobile phones, we had landline phones. You had to remember everyone's phone number, and you should dial it with your finger. So this is just how we progress, and AI is part of that. And it's nothing more than a really easy and quick way to automate things we do. Now, there's lots that we should be automating in project delivery, because as projects get larger and more complex, and we could go down that rabbit hole, but maybe we don't want to. But it's a way for us to utilize the power of AI in that complexity to help us with it. So hopefully that's laid a fairly simple foundation for us, Andy.
Yeah, so in the way you've just described it there, you really sort of focused on the fact that it's an assistant or something that's sort of enhancing our sort of existing capabilities that we have as sort of humans in our sort of project context. So we'll perhaps come back to that. And there's a couple of things that I want to follow up on, but I'll bring in Huda first before we have a sort of a discussion on your bit. So Huda, I think I may have just got your job title not quite right. So do you want to just say hello and introduce yourself, and then we'll cover the bit that you introduced us for the seminars around the biases, and I'll come on to that in a moment.
Thank you so much. Sorry, no, I just wanted to say, yes, I lead capital projects and infrastructure for the UK, Ireland, and Africa, but not for the entirety of the industry, just within Accenture. That's always.
Sorry. Right, thanks.
But thank you very much for having me. And yes, bias in AI. How can I add to the conversation?
Yeah, so the aspects of bias. I mean, obviously, humans are biased, and it's sort of it's inherent in the sort of heuristics of our decision making, which then leads to sort of obviously some of the downsides of bias as well. But you sort of focus in terms of thinking about, there's a fear of the bias that we have from AI, and we hear about hallucinations and so on that these sort of, particularly the generative AI, can produce. And you talked about sort of the data bias in terms of where we might be getting insights, but actually we've only got that sort of incomplete data that we're using it. And I was reminded of there's a classic example, isn't it, of the RAF studying the Spitfires that returned from the missions in the Second World War, in terms of where the bullet holes were, and then they started to reinforce those. But clearly what they weren't doing was inspecting the Spitfires that never returned, and so they weren't just learning where the bullet holes were of those things that caused those planes to crash. And so that was an area where there was a bit of data bias in the modeling. And then you talked about algorithmic bias, and then obviously then you covered sort of human bias as well. And I thought it was really interesting in terms of our obviously the work that the Major Project Association does around diversity and inclusion and so on. We include our inclusion moments, which is where you're sort of bit led from. But I think it prompted a much broader discussion around the issues, but also the opportunities in terms of using AI to help us with bias. So I wonder perhaps if you could just expand on that a little for us.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, I think AI is going to be, and is currently, whether people realize it or not, a fundamental part of how we do a lot of how we live our lives and how we do our jobs. And as Dale explained, it could be from the very simple to the very sort of complicated, and more artificial or more intelligence, depending on how you go across that spectrum. And the three sources, or the three types of bias that I was talking about, as you said, is the first one was data bias. So actually the data that you put into the system, if that is prejudiced through our own unconscious biases, then that actually is unlikely to give out a balanced view. It's always going to have that, it's going to be colored by what we put in it. It will reflect those biases. So for example, if we're going to collect data and it's based on data collected through apps, then that kind of prejudices the data, because you won't have data from people who don't have the apps or who don't use smartphones. So you've cut out a whole sort of chunk of people who you might want their data from. The second is the algorithmic bias, which is about the design of how the actual algorithm could favor certain outcomes over others, what the algorithm thinks is a successful output, and that's something that needs to be considered. And then the human bias, which is how we might unintentionally create bias in the whole of the system. And I think AI has some really powerful uses in EDI and in inclusivity, because in theory, you could create a system that if it has the correct data and it has mindfully designed algorithms and you've removed as much of the human error and human bias as possible, it will make a very balanced decision on who to hire, for example, right? It will make a very balanced decision on, or it will guide your decision on what sort of path to take in any decision making that is devoid of any of these emotional biases. But as we said, if you build them in, then you're kind of stuck in it. And I think that the three examples that people talk about and that there are lots of case studies on at the moment is, the first one is, as I just mentioned, the hiring algorithm. So if you're saying we're going to use an algorithm that's going to be, and the purpose is to increase gender balance, for example, in any kind of hiring situation, but the algorithm is set on who we have hired in the past, then it might be that, especially in major projects, there is a high prevalence of, say, white males. So eventually the algorithm will think that a successful candidate is a white male. So there will be a bias in it choosing white males, when actually what you're trying to do is address that and create a more balanced outcome. Another one is facial recognition. So I find this really interesting because apparently the way systems currently work and facial recognition currently works, the bias is that it is unlikely to identify women of color. I think the error margin on that is something like 30 to 35%, whereas white males are almost have a sort of error margin of nearly zero. So your facial recognition is more likely to recognize you if you're white male than if you're a woman of color, which creates challenges such as, I mean, you can think of challenges in other sectors like in law enforcement and security, but also I would say in like safety, because we will be using, and we've started to use facial recognition when people are going onto construction sites, right? So we're using that as a method of identifying access to, say, areas that have a permit to dig, or areas that site areas that require specific skills. So if it's not recognizing the right people, you can see how that's going to create safety challenges. And then healthcare. I mean, the fact is that healthcare, the AI in the healthcare systems at the moment seems to provide much lower care recommendations for minority patients. I mean, that affects everyone on site in major projects in every aspect of life.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because some of those biases you were sort of giving some examples on are things that have always existed in, say, recruitment. It's just that the bias has come through, processes and practice, and what we're now seeing is some of those process and practice is now being reflected in these algorithms and so on. So some aspects are it's just sort of, as with any things, when we have automated things, it's just making those bias more efficient, more and more effective in the wrong way in that respect. But some of those biases are brand new. The facial recognition one, is a bias that we've not had previously, and it's sort of it's potentially hindering opportunities in terms of, as you say, health and safety and other aspects on site. And I'm also thinking in terms of when we held the seminar about how we exploit some of these superpowers that are available to us, particularly around pattern recognition and sort of the generative AI in producing things that are It's fantastic at doing sort of analogous comparisons from one domain to another and generating some output. But we need to make sure that we're using those in the right way so that we either recognize there might be bias in there, or or we can use it in a way of saying, can you check this for bias? So I don't know in your line of work, Huda, whether you're coming across examples of how organizations are tackling that sort of bias to help on the opportunities side of things.
Well, actually, yes, I think that's I can give you some examples, but I want to just mention that I recently found that it's possible to do a qualification in being an AI auditor, which I thought was so interesting. So there's now a role called an AI auditor, who is a person who is qualified or certified or trained in understanding how to identify where there's bias in the AI, which is interesting. So, it creates roles as well. So I think for me, where I've seen examples of people really mindfully considering it is when they've considered like 4 approaches to make sure that there is no, or you've limited the bias in AI. And the first is making sure that the data you're putting in is diverse and representative. So this requires mindful thinking and planning and making sure, and sort of testing. The second is creating algorithmic transparency and accountability. So checking things. So developers should be trying to be as transparent as possible with their algorithms, and people need to make sure, or clients need to make sure, that they're very clear on the outcomes they're aiming for, rather than just, so AI is a means to an end, right? We are trying to, for example, in the hiring situation, you're trying to increase the diversity and the balance of your workforce. So that kind of needs to feed into the sort of outcomes required from the AI. And then ongoing monitoring and evaluation. I mean, humans are not perfect, and AI is certainly not perfect. So making sure that you are continuously monitoring for bias and regularly updating the systems to make sure that they remain fair and equitable is the way to do it. And we've seen sort of clients really thinking about that, especially when it comes to things like the hiring element.
Yes, and I've seen some examples in the sort of from an infrastructure perspective in design as well, where you can use AI through the use of personas to check things and to evaluate what the experience of different types of users could be, based upon those designs. And the example I came across was the height of signs, which is optimized for people to see. So there's certain heights and so on. But if you're visually impaired, the guide dog might not pick up that this sign is going to be at your head height, and take you down something you can sort of bump into things. So it was a really good example of how you can sort of test things with different personas. And by way of experiment, I played with OpenAI's ChatGPT and asked it to have 3 personas, and one was Donald Trump, one was Nelson Mandela, and the other one was Greta Thunberg, and asked it to rewrite my email I was going to send in the 3 styles, or each of those styles. And when you saw them, you would just recognize them. Actually, that one was Nelson Mandela, that one was Donald Trump, and that one was Greta Thunberg. So it's a great way for us to use those things to do that testing. Could you respond to what I'm about to propose in a way that represents these different personas, and they could be users of our infrastructure, for example. So I think we're just tapping into some of those opportunities. Dale, I'd like to revert back to one of the things that you mentioned in your sort of explainer you provided for the seminar back in June, and it was around the sort of fear of adoption. And you mentioned that sort of major projects is a little slow to uptake, on the uptake of AI compared to other management disciplines or domains. I think you talked about construction rather than projects in that example, and just really want to explore where do we think that fear is coming from compared to other management disciplines or domains?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think Let me first, I just want to comment on the bias topic before I move on, because I think it's interesting and fascinating. I think it's probably worth noting as well that biases aren't all that bad as well, because it's based on the data we know. We just need to apply critical thinking when we're looking at outcomes. Is this biased? Is it not? But the beauty about it as well is that machines, computers, are far more malleable than humans, so we can correct machine learning AI biases easier than us as individuals. So just a few thoughts and comments out there. In terms of adoption, I did a bit of research because my background is project controls. I like data. And although it was a survey, as you're saying, the Construction Industry Institute survey of 2022, there were some interesting facts that came out of that. And I don't think it's changed too much. But let me just rattle through some of them, Andy, for the audience, and then we can unpick some of them. So some of them were that 70% are aware of AI technologies and the potential benefits. And I think that's increased over the past couple of years. 30% believe that they had a strong understanding of how to implement AI in their projects. That means 70% didn't. 65% believe that AI can significantly improve project planning and scheduling. Okay. 60% see AI as a tool for enhancing safety, and 55% think AI can reduce project costs. So only 55% think that. Now, some of the barriers, this came back from feedback from the survey, was that 75% thought that there were high implementation costs. Now, I think that is not true, because there's a lack of understanding of exactly what AI is, and rightly so, because there's so many different branches of AI. Right. The one I think that most people are familiar with, as you quite rightly said, is OpenAI's ChatGPT, Gemini, large language models, i.e., a glorified chatbot. Let's just call it what it is, right? But all it's doing is it's just predicting what the next word should be based on what it's learned. It's distilling a whole bunch of information. Through that, you're also getting things like prompt engineering coming about. So can I get better at prompting? To your point, the 3 different personas. And so bring that back to the cost concerns. When you look at, okay, how does this do this? What's this black box? And then you try and apply it to things like digital twins and, applying AI to design engineering, applying AI to, instead of Monte Carlo analysis, now I'm using AI to predict my risks. All these weird and wonderful things. Can I use AI for delay analysis on projects? How do I take all of the stuff I'm doing on computers to site? Because AI is robotics as well. We're not quite there yet, but I'd love to see how we can enhance safety on site using robotics or even productivity rates. Continuing with the barriers to adoption, lack of expertise was another one. So the 68% shortage of skilled professionals was interesting, and I think that fed into the belief that there were high costs for implementation. There's a resistance to change. So 55% believe that cultural resistance within organizations, I think that's still there. Data privacy and security. So this is a big one as well. Although only 50% were concerned about it, I think in reality probably more people are concerned about it than the survey suggests. And one that I added, Andy, but I don't have any particular figure because this didn't come from the survey, but I personally believe that strategic misrepresentation is a barrier. What I mean by that is that people won't want to adopt and use AI because they're concerned that AI won't tell the story that they want. I know I'm being a bit provocative here, but most project professionals, or project managers, project directors want to control the narrative to their audience. And if you let something loose, a technology loose, and just let it free, it's not necessarily going to tell the story that you want it to tell.
Yeah, and that strategic misrepresentation, we could have a whole different podcast discussion on that one. But I'm with you on that. And I think this is an area where the use of AI and more so the data analytics side of things will really help on mitigating or minimizing the negative impacts of strategic misrepresentation. And I often wonder, we ought to have sort of the black box equivalent, the flight recorder equivalent on our projects. So we have that full record of the basis of every decision at every level, so that we can trace back to near misses rather than actual accidents, to see how how do we reach that decision that in future we'll come back and reflect wasn't the ideal or the best decision that we reached. It'd be fantastic to unpick that. At the moment, we can't, and we tend to do it through anecdotes or through who we interview, and our recollection of past facts often aren't quite the same as what really happened. So anyway, we can get on to that as a different discussion. But I think there's a real, I think a lot of our use of AI is going to be in the governance and assurance space rather than in the project work space, and perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment. Thanks for that, Dale. But fascinating bit, because the sort of the percentages you provide then are very similar in the conclusions drawn by the business school at Warwick University that was commissioned by APM to look at the barriers of data analytics rather than AI. It's done 4 years ago. It was APM did it, Warwick undertook the study, but it was with NPA members. So it was a nice joint initiative between NPA and APM, and the skills, the data, and the perceived costs and the perceived lack of benefits, it was coming through that, which I found fascinating, because what is it that we're accused of as project professionals? We're accused of overstating the benefits, understating the time, and understating the costs. And yet when we ask project professionals, do you want to use AI? I said, oh no, it's going to take a really long time to do it. It's going to cost loads, and actually the benefits aren't real. So it's almost 180 degrees from what we do with our clients, perhaps, or the beneficiaries of our projects. But perhaps that's another philosophical discussion on why that could be the case. Looking forward now to our conference that's coming up in October. We sort of got 3 principal sessions that we're planning for the conference. The first one is around the sweet spot of major projects. So I mentioned the superpowers that we can get from AI, but where are those superpowers best applied? The second one's around the governance and ethics considerations. I think we've been touching on that with the bias aspects just now. And then the third one is the impact on members and the profession. And Dale, that sort of leads on to some of the skills and the role discussion that you're having. But if we can just sort of think about that sweet spot bit first, and I'll describe the lens that I would like you to think of for the sweet spot. So I view sort of the world of major projects from sort of 4 layers, if you like. At the one layer, you've got what I call the project product. So the thing that we're producing from the project. So if it's a transport system, we might use AI in that project product to do things like optimizing of routes and so on, or the scheduling. But it could be used in the project product itself. Then we've got project work. So in construction, it would be like the health and safety aspects that you were just talking about would be unique to a particular type of project, but it's about the project work. The layer above that is around project management. So you just talked about scheduling and risk and controls. And then above that, it would be around project scoping and selection. So what are the best set of projects to do with the available resources that we have? And so there's 4 different aspects, from the project product, project work, project management, to effectively portfolio management, where we can use AI in projects. And I just wondered if perhaps we can do it the first bit. Where do you think it's mostly being applied today? And perhaps where do you think that sweet spot would be in terms of where we get the biggest bang for our buck if we were applying AI to those 4 layers? Who would like to come in on that first?
Shall I have the first count? So, first of all, I think AI needs to be applied to all 4 of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I can go on a slight tangent, if that's okay, I think AI is important, and talking about AI is important. But I think there is a fundamental challenge we have, which is how our industry collects, preserves, and uses data. And I think sometimes AI is a great instigator of change. So we can tell organizations you should use AI, and they want to use AI. So that helps them tidy up their data, collect it better, preserve it, create this corporate memory of data. So it's kind of, we use it to fix other problems that they should already have, which kind of refers back to what you said, which is the fact that you can use AI for, no one recalls what happened in the accident other than through interviews, because we don't sort of really have corporate memory of data. So if you think about corporate memory of data as kind of the fundamental thing, if you looked at it from bottom up, and if I say to you, I would look at it from top down. So when you're first deciding why we should invest in a capital measure program, it's to deliver specific outcomes, right? So the data that we have should be about outcomes. So when I'm thinking of how government sets policy, government should also be thinking about how the data will drive this policy, and how the policy will drive this data. And I see intent to do some of those things when we look at planning, for example, for major programs, and some of the clients we talk to about how they want to use data and AI for planning purposes. So that helps them select projects, but also think about planning and consenting, and how to manage the planning and consenting processes more efficiently. And again, we would go from AI, simple AI, which is basic machine learning, all the way to generative AI, which might give opinionated optioneering. I've just coined it a phrase, but you know what I mean. It helps you sort of make better decisions. So that's from the top end, from the big, before we start strategy policy. But then moving down across the sort of life cycle to when you're on site. I mean, the stuff on site, the AI on site is already happening. People are already using, the fact that we, in the UK, BIM is mandated since 2016, and how people are trying to extrapolate this sort of data to make sure that it works for projects and how we build them. I think that's already kind of in train. So the trick, or the magic, the real magic, will be when we stitch all these things together. When we have the bit of data and a bit of AI we're using across those four lenses, if we connect it, so we are truly mindfully designing our infrastructure from upfront, and thinking how we're going to manage it, and all the data from the moment we design it, and we plan for it, design it, commission it, and then we're operating it. That's the magic. That's how AI is going to change our lives.
Yeah, and that's difficult for people to maintain that map, all the way through. And you used the term complexity earlier, and that's where there is a superpower, isn't there, in terms of being able to maintain that view of those connections and those patterns across those different layers, and over a sort of temporal view as well, over months and years, and thinking about how that changes. And I think we will get some real value from using it in that way. Dan, what about you, in terms of where do you think that sweet spot sits?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. First to comment, I love the fact, Huda, you brought up, the data. We all know garbage in, gospel out, right? But it applies to humans. We are what we eat, right? If we eat unhealthily, guess what? We'll be unhealthy. So if you're feeding unhealthy data into AI, unhealthy outcomes come out of it. I think currently most of the focus is in the office when it comes to AI. So forecasting, schedule particularly, risks particularly. I think there's an increase in particularly startups looking at AI in the field. So, perhaps I can use cameras, perhaps I can use drones, perhaps I can use all sorts of things on site where I can look at digital twins and understand, does my design meet with what's actually being delivered on site. However, and I actually like the lenses you apply today, Andy, because that lends itself to my view in a sense, because I think the biggest bang for the buck is going to be autonomous agents, autonomous AI agents, where these agents have roles specifically and have agency to make the right decisions and communicate with each other. So they can be agents through all four of those lenses, but because they are domain specific, they can connect with each other. They can talk to each other and they can make decisions far quicker than we would take to make decisions in a safe way, in a way that's in line with the scope, in the best way forward in terms of looking at your risks, in terms of your costs and your schedules and all these other things that you require. So in the future, I might be sounding provocative, is replacing some of the office work that's happening, some of the time and the process it takes for humans to make decisions, because you can build that all into computers that don't sleep. So yeah, something to ponder perhaps.
Yeah, and that's going
AI
to
taking over jobs. Wow.
Yeah, why not, right? Let's have more time to go to the beach or read books and go to nature. Why not?
Yeah. I think that's really going to lead into the third part of our annual conference around the impact on members and major projects, and it will be around that impact on roles and hopefully, as you say, whether it's going to the beach or doing other things, but it will give us more time to do the more value adding activities rather than Joe, you come from a project controls perspective, and there's a lot of drudgery, isn't there, that goes on in that office-based work of collecting information, processing it, reporting it. Sometimes it never even gets read or acted upon. So whereas perhaps we can remove some of those things and do things in a more meaningful, purposeful way. That time has flown just now. So we're coming to the end of our recording. So what I'd like to do is just give you both a chance to sort of offer one sort of final thought, whether that's a top tip or a key bit of insight you think our listeners would gain from you sharing.
If I jumped in first, I think the most important thing is to always keep learning. It's a changing landscape. Diversify your options you have, whether you're a project planner, project manager, site engineer, designer. When you're working on projects, I think Huda, you alluded to it, AI is here to stay and will impact you in some way, shape or form. Ensure that you remain relevant.
Great.
Be curious, but be careful.
Curious and careful. Brilliant. Thanks, Dale. Huda?
I guess I would say that AI has amazing promise. It's going to change. It is currently and will continue to change the world. Technology is really cool. It's going to change the sort of makeup of our industry and the people who work in it. It's going to attract different types of people, and I think all that is great. And I just want to encourage people to I don't know, try do something different. Just keep looking ahead and do something different and be brave and don't worry. It's not somebody who AI is not going to change, is not going to take away your job, no matter what Dale just said. I don't think AI is going to take away your job, but somebody who knows how to use AI will.
Yes, I think that's a really good point on that. So great. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Firstly, for the seminar back in June, and also volunteering to do this follow-up session today. As I've mentioned, we have our annual conference coming up in October. So invitations for that have gone out to the main representatives of MPA members. So if you're not booked on to attend yet, then get in touch with your main rep and see if you can secure the space. It's provisionally one place per member comes along to the conference. So please do look out for that. I mentioned at the beginning, this is the second of 3 podcasts that we're doing leading up to the conference. So the third one, which was due to be done in November, but we brought it forward a little bit, is an annual follow-up to a session I did last year with Lawrence Rowland, where we looked at what happened to OpenAI's ChatGPT 1 year from its launch. And Lawrence said that it moved from being a curiosity to sort of like an over-enthusiastic intern or grad coming into your workplace. So be fascinating to find out from Lawrence, with his curiosity and his sort of experimentation, how far it's moved on from another year, or almost another year from when we looked at it last time. So please do look out for that one as well. And lastly, thank you for listening today, and do subscribe to our podcasts if you haven't done so already.